I never thought I'd be one of those people who falls asleep on the subway and wakes up hours later, missing my stop. I wasn't exhausted, just a little late. It was a Tuesday night. No, Wednesday morning, technically. About 1:30 a.m. I had stayed late at work in Midtown, trying to wrap up a project, and by the time I got to the platform, the train station was eerily empty. It always felt strange seeing New York so still. The train finally rumbled into the station, and I stepped into a nearly deserted car. There were only 2 other people in my car. A man slumped over in the far corner and a woman with headphones, lost in whatever song was playing. I took my usual seat by the door, leaned back, and closed my eyes. The rumbling of the subway usually soothed me. It felt like the heartbeat of the city. I must have dozed off for a bit, because when I opened my eyes, the car was empty. It didn't strike me as odd at first. New York subways are like that. People come and go, get off at random stops. I checked my watch. It was now 2:15 a.m., and I should have been closer to home in Brooklyn. I glanced up at the route map, expecting to see we were at least on the right track. Except none of the lights on the map were lit. It was dark, like the train wasn't even on the line anymore. I rubbed my eyes, shaking off the last remnants of sleep. Still, no lights. I stood up and walked toward the window at the end of the car to check for the station name, but when I pressed my face to the glass, all I could see was darkness. The subway tunnel was pitch black, like we were in some kind of void, without the usual flickering lights or graffiti-streaked walls. Just nothing. My stomach twisted, a knot of unease forming as I moved to the next car. It was empty, too. I moved through 3 more cars, each one completely deserted. There wasn't a soul in sight, and now I couldn't hear the hum of the subway moving along the tracks anymore. No screech of the wheels against the rails, just an oppressive, suffocating silence. Then I saw him. A figure, hunched in the farthest corner of the car, just beyond where the dim light from my car ended. At first, I thought it was the same man I had noticed earlier, sleeping. But the longer I stared, the more something about him felt wrong. He wasn't moving, wasn't breathing, not even slumped over in a natural way. Just sitting there, completely still. I gulped and started to walk back to my seat. My pulse quickened with each step. "Don't freak out," I told myself. "It's late, you're tired, you missed your stop. That's it." I sat down, trying to shake the strange sense of dread building in my chest. When I glanced back up, the figure was standing now, in the same car, just standing. I blinked, telling myself it was just my imagination. "You're overtired. You've been working too many late nights." The figure didn't move, though. Just stood there, its face obscured by the shadows. I tried to look away, but it felt like something was pulling my gaze back. Something primal. Something deep within me screamed to get off this train. I jumped to my feet, bolting for the door that led between the cars. But when I pulled on the handle, it didn't budge. It was locked. I banged on the door, trying to force it open, but it wouldn't give. My breath came faster now, a slight panic rising in my throat. I turned back toward the figure. It had moved closer. Not walking, not stepping, just closer. Now only 2 cars away. I backed away, pulling at the door again, this time with more force, ignoring the sign warning against opening it while the train was moving. My heart pounded in my ears, and sweat began to collect on my forehead. I could feel him getting closer. The air seemed heavier, suffocating, like the space itself was closing in on me. With one last desperate shove, I yanked the door open and stumbled into the next car, slamming it behind me. I gasped for air, trying to calm myself. I'd never felt this way before. I wasn't the type to get scared easily, but this was different. I glanced out the window into the next car. The figure was gone. For a moment, I thought I had imagined the whole thing. That maybe it was just a trick of the dim lights or my tired brain. But as I turned back to the seats in the new car, my breath caught in my throat. He was there, standing in the aisle directly in front of me. I froze, my heart thudding in my chest. The figure didn't move. It didn't need to. Because the lights in the car flickered, and for a brief second, I saw its face, or what was left of it. Pale, sunken eyes, skin stretched too tight over bone, lips too thin, as though stitched together, and then darkness swallowed the figure again. The train screeched suddenly, and with that sound came the crushing weight of a truth I hadn't realized yet. I wasn't alone on this train, and I had no idea where it was taking me. I stumbled backward, my legs threatening to give out as the figure loomed in the aisle. The lights flickered again, just long enough for me to catch another glimpse of it. This time, something had changed. The face, already grotesque, seemed even more distorted. Its eyes were farther apart now, too far apart, like two sets of eyes had been crammed into one skull. My breath hitched, and I forced myself to keep moving. Get out. Get out. I bolted toward the next car, heart pounding so hard it drowned out every other sound. The door was locked, of course. It always was. I grabbed the handle and yanked as hard as I could, desperate to get away from whatever the hell that thing was. The door creaked, but wouldn't budge. Behind me, the figure moved again. I didn't turn around this time. I couldn't. But I could hear it now. A soft, sickening crackling sound, like bones shifting unnaturally, joints popping in ways they weren't supposed to. It was getting closer. The lights flickered again, and I caught a glimpse of a reflection in the window in front of me. The figure had changed. More limbs, arms, jutting out from its sides, twisting at odd angles. One of the arms was where its head should have been. No, in its head, like something had been forced inside it, merging with the body. I gasped, pulling at the door harder, slamming my shoulder into it until finally, it clicked open. I shoved it aside and stumbled into the next car, slamming the door behind me. But even as I closed it, I knew it wouldn't help. The thing didn't need to use doors. It could follow me however it wanted. It didn't follow the same rules. I looked up and realized with dawning horror that I wasn't alone in this car. There were figures all around me now, sitting in the seats like passengers. Except, they weren't people, not anymore. They looked like half-finished sculptures, twisted versions of human bodies. Their faces were smeared, as if someone had pressed their hands into wet clay. Some of them had extra limbs sprouting out of places limbs should never be. Others were missing parts of their bodies altogether. But they all turned toward me as I entered. I froze. For a split second, the car was dead silent. No movement, no sound. Just the dull hum of the train moving through the darkness. My pulse thundered in my ears, but I didn't dare move. Then one of the things sitting in a seat turned its head too far around, like its neck had no bones at all, and smiled. Or at least it tried to. The corner of its mouth pulled up, but it was like the muscles didn't work right, its jaw half hanging off. It was wrong, all of it, like someone had taken parts of a dozen people and mashed them together. The air in the car felt thick, almost suffocating. The figures, twisted amalgamations of bodies, shifted in their seats, but none of them stood. They didn't need to. The thing behind me was still coming. I ran, I didn't care anymore where I was going. I just needed to get out. My feet slammed against the floor and I flung open the next door, charging into another car. Empty. For a second, I thought I'd escaped the nightmare, but then I heard the door behind me open with a soft, deliberate click. I turned. The figure from before, the thing, stood in the doorway, still changing. Its limbs twitched and jerked as if they were being pulled by invisible strings. I watched in horror as the arm from its head twisted down toward its side, and now it had too many legs, one of them growing out from its stomach. The lights flickered again, and when they came back, the thing was closer. I backed away, keeping my eyes on it. My chest tightened, panic rising in my throat. It was changing faster now, like the train was speeding up whatever was happening to it. Was it human once? I couldn't even tell anymore. My back hit the wall of the car, and I realized I had nowhere else to go. This was the last car. The thing moved toward me, slower now, but deliberate. The air around it seemed to hum, like the train itself was reacting to it. I could hear the crackle of joints popping again, bones shifting beneath the skin, reshaping in ways that defied reason. Its head split open for a moment, revealing more eyes, more teeth, before closing back into a face that didn't look remotely human. It stopped, just a few feet away from me. I could see it breathing now, the rise and fall of its chest, or at least what was supposed to be its chest. The extra limbs jutted out at odd angles, and its face, it was almost a collection of faces now. Eyes from different people, mouths from others, stitched together into one grotesque form. I pressed myself against the wall, my heart hammering in my chest. I had nowhere to go. There was no escape. The figure tilted its head, its many heads now, all slightly out of sync with each other, and I could swear I heard it whisper, "Home." Its voice was soft, barely a breath, but I heard it clearly. "No," I choked out, shaking my head. This isn't real." The thing's heads twisted again, the faces rearranging themselves into something resembling a smile. It took a step closer. I shut my eyes, waiting for it to reach me, to end this nightmare. But instead, I heard something worse. The sound of the subway slowing down. I opened my eyes, and the thing had disappeared. The lights were dim again, flickering sporadically. The car looked normal, empty, silent, like nothing had happened. Except for one thing. The train was stopping. The doors would open soon, and I had no idea what would be waiting on the other side. The train slowed to a halt, the screech of metal grinding against metal echoing unnaturally in the empty car. My heart pounded, every beat a reminder that I had no idea what waited beyond those doors. For a moment, everything was still. The air, thick with an oppressive tension, seemed to press down on me from all sides. The doors slid open, and I was greeted by a station bathed in dim, sickly light. I stepped forward, hesitating at the threshold as the stale air rushed to meet me. The station platform was like nothing I'd ever seen in New York. The walls dripped with moisture, grime thick on the tiles, and there was no sign of life anywhere. The familiar graffiti that covered every subway stop in the city was replaced with strange symbols, twisted shapes and jagged lines that made my skin crawl just looking at them. I glanced back at the train. The door remained open, almost inviting me to return to the car. But the thought of being trapped with that thing again, that twisting, shifting nightmare of a creature, made my decision for me. I had to leave. I took a cautious step onto the platform, half expecting something to lunge at me from the shadows. But nothing came. The silence stretched on, punctuated only by the distant sound of dripping water. I moved further away from the train, scanning the platform for some sign of where I was. No station name was visible. No maps. No signs. Not even the familiar green and white subway tiles. Then I saw something. Movement in the far corner of the platform. A figure stood there, its back turned to me, dressed in a dark coat. Relief washed over me at the thought of another person. Maybe they knew what this place was. Maybe they could help me get back. "Hey," I called, my voice bouncing off the walls in the strange emptiness. The figure didn't respond. I stepped closer, and something about the way it stood there, completely unmoving, sent a shiver down my spine. As I approached, I noticed its posture wasn't right. Too rigid. Unnatural. I slowed down, my instincts screaming at me to turn back, but I couldn't help it. I had to know. I was only a few feet away when the figure's head tilted. No, its entire torso rotated toward me. The movement was wrong, like something inside had snapped to allow that twist. And then I saw its face, or what should have been its face. A mess of features jumbled together in a horrifying blend. Eyes layered on top of eyes, some far too large, others little more than slits. Multiple noses, and a grin that stretched across its entire face, showing rows of uneven, mismatched teeth. Its mouth opened, but instead of words, a garbled noise emerged, like several voices speaking at once, overlapping each other, too distorted to understand. I stumbled back, heart hammering in my chest. This wasn't a person. It was something else. Another one of those things. A patchwork of bodies, lives, identities, all fused into one. The figure stepped toward me, its many eyes blinking out of sync, its head twitching unnaturally as it moved. I spun around, scanning the platform for an exit. There, at the far end of the station, a staircase leading up. Without thinking, I ran, my footsteps loud in the otherwise silent station. Behind me, the thing's garbled sounds grew louder, closer. I didn't dare look back. I reached the stairs and started to climb, taking them two at a time, desperate to put as much distance between me and the nightmare below. The dim light from the platform faded with every step, and the stairs seemed to stretch on forever, the air growing heavier with each breath. When I finally reached the top, I burst through a rusted metal gate and into a narrow, decrepit hallway. The walls here were close, suffocating. Cracked tiles and peeling paint surrounded me, the ceiling sagging in some places as if the weight of the city above was crushing it. There were no signs, no directions, just a long, winding corridor with no clear end in sight. I pressed forward, not daring to stop. But the further I walked, the more the space around me began to change. The walls were no longer just cracked. They had merged. Not just with the floor or ceiling, but with objects. With people. I stopped, staring at the wall beside me. Embedded into it was a figure, no longer whole, but fused into the brick and tile. A woman's face. Her mouth frozen in a silent scream, her arms stretched out, half swallowed by the wall itself. Her skin was pale, translucent almost, and where her body met the stone, it melted seamlessly, like wax dripping down a candle. I felt bile rise in my throat, my skin crawling with the realization that the walls were alive. The passage grew narrower as I moved forward, and more of these figures appeared. Some barely recognizable as human, their features melted and distorted beyond comprehension. Others still holding on to the last shreds of what they had been. My breath quickened as the air seemed to thicken, the narrow hallway closing in. I had to get out. I had to find a way back to something that made sense. But with every step I took, the space twisted further, and then I heard it, behind me. That same sickening, crackling noise, the one from the train. I turned, knowing what I would see. The thing from the subway was there, at the far end of the corridor, moving toward me. Its body was now even more misshapen, its limbs barely recognizable. It didn't run. It didn't have to. The walls around me, the figures trapped in them, seemed to pulse, reacting to its presence. I sprinted forward, my lungs burning as I forced myself through the narrowing space, the ceiling pressing down lower, the walls closing in tighter. The air grew heavier, making it harder to breathe. My vision blurred, the corridor stretching endlessly ahead of me. And still, that thing followed. It didn't make sense. Nothing did. I wasn't in New York anymore. Not the real one. This place was something else. A place that fed on fear. My feet pounded against the uneven floor, each step slower than the last. It felt like running through thick mud, the corridor stretching impossibly long in front of me. Behind me, the crackling, shifting sound of that thing echoed closer, the noise seeping into my bones. The walls were pressing in on me, the figures trapped within them writhing in their eternal imprisonment. I dared a glance back, instantly regretting it. The creature was no longer recognizable as the figure that had followed me from the train. It had grown grotesquely large, its limbs fusing and separating, twisting into shapes that defied anatomy. Where there had been one face, there were now dozens, some incomplete, others bulging from its surface like the clay of a deranged sculptor. Arms, legs, and faces writhed and churned beneath its surface, as if an entire crowd of people had been melted into one nightmare. Eyes blinked and rolled in every direction, mouths stretched open in a cacophony of silent screams. I stumbled, catching myself on the wall. But the wall wasn't stone anymore. It pulsed under my hand, warm and fleshy. I recoiled, realizing the entire passage had started to breathe, its surface slick and glistening. The figures embedded in the walls moaned as they shifted, their bodies slowly becoming part of the living architecture. "Help me." A voice, barely audible, came from my left. I turned and saw a man's face, his head half merged with the wall, his eyes wide with terror. His mouth moved, trying to speak, but his lower jaw was already fused into the brick-like substance that had claimed him. His arm twitched, sticking out of the wall like a broken branch, fingers stretching toward me in a grotesque plea. I couldn't stop. I couldn't help him. I ran, pushing myself through the narrowing corridor, the walls now pulsating as if the entire space was alive. The floor beneath my feet felt unstable, shifting and bubbling as though something massive moved beneath it. The thing behind me, the creature of limbs and faces, was still coming. Closer, always closer. The sound of its twisted body sliding along the walls grew louder, and I could feel its presence like a weight pressing on my back. The air itself seemed to shudder with each unnatural movement it made, as though the space was bending to accommodate it. I wasn't just being chased. The very walls were herding me toward something. Then, without warning, the corridor opened into a larger space, a chamber. The walls here were different, even more grotesque. They pulsed with veins, like some giant creature's insides, slick with a viscous fluid that dripped from the ceiling in long, slow streams. The figures in the walls had become even more distorted, their faces blending into one another, their limbs tangled and fused. Some of them still had faint traces of humanity, their eyes darting frantically, mouths open in a twisted parody of speech. Others were beyond recognition, mere lumps of flesh and bone, indistinguishable from the walls themselves. In the center of the chamber stood something worse than anything I had seen yet. A mass of bodies, twisted and fused together, reached up toward the ceiling. At first, it seemed like a pillar of writhing flesh, but as I looked closer, I saw faces. Hundreds of faces. Some of them still looked human, their eyes pleading for release, their mouths moving soundlessly. But others were little more than smoothed-over lumps of skin, like they had melted into the structure. And then, from within the mass, something moved. The creature from the subway. Its many limbs twisted and stretched, dragging itself from the dark recesses of the pillar of flesh. As it emerged, its form shifted again. This time, it was even larger, its body bloated and deformed. Its heads, too many heads, blinked in unison, and its mouths opened in a slow, grotesque grin, revealing jagged teeth that seemed to belong to a dozen different creatures. The air around it vibrated, as though the entire chamber was reacting to its presence. I took a step back, my mind racing for some kind of escape. But there was nowhere to go. The walls were alive, the floor was shifting beneath my feet, and the thing in front of me was blocking the only exit. Then, without warning, the creature began to speak. Not with words, but with a low, rumbling sound that resonated through the entire space. It wasn't a language, at least not one I could understand, but the meaning was clear. It was calling me. No. I stumbled backward, my eyes darting around for something, anything, that could get me out of here. But the walls were closing in, tightening like a fist around the chamber. The figures trapped in the flesh groaned and shifted, their limbs reaching out, their fingers brushing against me as I backed away. The creature took another step forward, its many eyes fixed on me, its mouths twitching in anticipation. I could feel its hunger, like it needed me to complete whatever horrific amalgamation it had become. My mind raced, panic clawing at the edges of my sanity. I couldn't let it touch me. If it did, I'd be lost. Just another face, another limb in its grotesque body. Desperation clawed at me. There had to be a way out. But the chamber was closing, the walls pressing tighter, and I was being forced toward the creature. The floor rippled beneath me, making it harder to move, harder to think. Then I saw it. Near the far wall, just beyond the mass of bodies, was an opening. Small, barely visible, but there. It was the only chance I had. I bolted. My legs were screaming in pain, my lungs burning, but I pushed myself forward. The creature lunged at me, its many arms and legs reaching out, but I dodged, skidding across the slick floor. The walls groaned in protest as I moved, the figures trapped within them writhing as if trying to grab me, trying to pull me into the living structure. The opening was just ahead. If I could make it, I might escape whatever this nightmare had become. But as I reached for it, something cold wrapped around my ankle. I looked down. A hand, gray, veined and slick with some unholy substance, was gripping me, pulling me back toward the creature. The thing's many faces were laughing now, a chorus of grotesque, distorted chuckles echoing through the chamber. I kicked at the hand, pulling myself free, and dove through the opening. I hit the ground hard, rolling through the narrow opening into a smaller tunnel. The air here was colder, the walls closer, but they weren't alive like the chamber behind me. It was darker, the only light a faint, sickly glow coming from some unseen source. My breath was ragged, my body trembling from exertion, but I was alive. For now. Behind me, the sound of the creature's laughter faded, but I knew it wasn't far. The thing could find me, no matter where I went. This place, it wasn't a labyrinth. It was more like a body. One I was trapped inside. I staggered to my feet, my ankle still aching from where that hand had grabbed me. I forced myself to keep moving down the narrow passage, unsure where it led. The tunnel twisted and turned, sloping downward. The deeper I went, the worse the smell became, like rotting flesh and damp earth. I don't know when I first noticed them, the limbs. At first I thought they were just part of the walls, the same as everything else. But as I moved, I realized they were attached to bodies, dozens of them. Pieces of people, lined the tunnel, their arms, legs, and torsos half buried in the walls and floor. Their faces were blank, their eyes closed. But their limbs, those were the worst. They stretched impossibly long, growing out of their bodies like roots, reaching in every direction. Some of them were twisted into strange, unnatural shapes, forming new, grotesque structures. The farther I walked, the more I saw. The limbs were everywhere. A terrible thought took root in my mind, one I didn't want to acknowledge, but couldn't push away. These weren't just random bodies, weren't just part of this nightmarish place. The thing that had been following me, the thing from the train, it had them. All those arms, all those legs. The creature wasn't just one thing. It was many. All of these bodies, all of these people. It had taken them, absorbed them, their limbs, their faces, their parts. It had stolen them and fused them together into that twisted form. That's why it kept growing, changing. It wasn't a single being. It was all of them, combined into one. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. The creature, it wasn't just coming for me. It wanted me to be part of it. Another piece, another limb to add to its collection. I wasn't being chased by a single monster. I was being hunted by everyone it had ever consumed. The limbs along the walls twitched, almost as if they could sense my thoughts. I recoiled, pressing myself against the opposite side of the narrow passage. The tunnel seemed to be getting smaller, the walls closing in, forcing me to crouch as I moved forward. My heart raced, and I tried to push the horrific image out of my mind. But it wouldn't leave. Those faces I had seen, the arms, the legs, they were once people. People who had been here before me. People who had gotten trapped in this hellish place, just like I had. And now they were part of it, merged into the creature. All those faces, all those limbs. It wasn't just a random collection. Each one had belonged to someone. Would I end up like them? My limbs stretching, twisting, pulled into that mass of bodies until there was nothing left of me but a grotesque fragment. Still alive, but no longer me? No, I wouldn't let that happen. I couldn't. The tunnel narrowed even more, forcing me to crawl on my hands and knees. My palms scraped against the rough surface, the walls pressing in on all sides. I could feel the air growing heavier, thick with the stench of decay. And then I heard it again. That crackling, shifting noise. It was coming. The thing was close. I moved faster, my body screaming in protest, crawling through the narrowing tunnel, the sound of the creature growing louder. I could hear it shifting, twisting its many limbs as it squeezed through the space behind me. It was faster now, more desperate. It knew I was close. Ahead of me, the tunnel opened up slightly. Not much, but enough for me to get to my feet. I scrambled forward, feeling the cold air hit my face as I stood. The tunnel curved sharply, and I followed it, barely able to keep my balance as I ran. The tunnel led to another chamber, smaller than the last, but just as grotesque. The walls pulsed, and in the center of the room was another pillar. This one was different, though. It wasn't made of bodies, at least not entirely. It was made of limbs. Just limbs. Dozens, maybe hundreds of arms and legs, all intertwined, forming a writhing column that stretched to the ceiling. The creature was closer now. I could feel it. The air grew thick with its presence. I had to keep moving. But there was no way out of this room. Only the tunnel I had just come from. I was trapped. The pillar of limbs twitched, shifting as I approached, A low, rumbling sound echoed from within it, and I realized with a jolt of horror that the limbs weren't dead. They were alive, moving, trying to pull themselves free from the mass. I backed away, my eyes darting around the room for some kind of escape. The walls seemed to pulse, almost as if they were breathing, and the floor shifted beneath me, soft and fleshy. Then the creature emerged from the tunnel, its many faces twisted into a grotesque grin, its limbs writhing as it crawled toward me. It was larger now, more grotesque, and the air around it seemed to hum with an unnatural energy. It moved slowly, deliberately, knowing there was nowhere for me to go. I backed away, my foot catching on something soft. I looked down and saw that I had stepped on an arm, one of the countless limbs scattered across the floor. It twitched beneath me, its fingers curling, as if it was still trying to escape the mass. My breath caught in my throat. I wasn't just in a room of limbs. I was in its room. The creature lurched forward, dragging its mass of twisted bodies through the opening into the chamber. The walls quivered in response, as if the space itself was terrified of what it had become. I stood frozen, my eyes locked on the grotesque thing in front of me. It was closer now, so close I could smell the stench of decay radiating from its many faces. Its heads, so many heads, tilted at odd angles, their mouths moving, forming silent, wordless screams. The air around me seemed to throb, a slow, rhythmic pulse that matched the twitching limbs surrounding me. The creature's legs, too numerous and too long, stretched out as it advanced, each step a sickening blend of bone and muscle cracking into new shapes. I glanced at the pillar of limbs in the center of the room. The arms and legs twisted and writhed as if they were aware of what was coming. They reached out, blindly groping for something to hold on to, or worse, for someone to join them. It was a grotesque, pulsating monument to everything this place had consumed. The thing in front of me wasn't just one creature. It was the embodiment of all the lives it had stolen. And now, it wanted me to be part of it. The realization hit me like a blow to the chest. The creature wasn't chasing me out of some mindless hunger or bloodlust. It was collecting. Every limb, every face, every piece of it had once belonged to someone. Someone trapped here. Someone consumed by this nightmare. It wasn't just a monster. It was many. My limbs would join that pillar. My face would be absorbed into that thing's ever-shifting body. And I would become part of this place, just like all the others. But I couldn't let that happen. With a surge of adrenaline, I forced my feet to move, backing away from the creature as it advanced. The walls pulsed around me, the air heavy with the weight of the creature's presence. My heart pounded in my chest, every instinct screaming at me to run, to fight, to do anything but stand still. The creature paused, its heads twisting in unison to look at me. I could feel its gaze, not just from its many eyes, but from the hundreds of faces trapped within its body, each one silently watching, waiting. It was as though it wanted me to understand what was happening, as if it was showing me my fate before it claimed me. "Is this what you want?" I muttered, my voice trembling. "To take everything?" The creature shifted, its form bubbling and swelling as if in response. I took another step back, my back now pressed against the cold, pulsing wall of the chamber. The writhing limbs along the pillar began to stretch toward me, their fingers brushing against my skin like they were already claiming me. I had to do something, anything. But there was no escape. The tunnel I had come from was blocked by the creature's massive form, and the walls around me seemed alive, pressing inward. I was trapped, the very air suffocating me. The creature moved again, its massive, disjointed form unfolding and refolding itself, pulling closer, its many faces twitching and stretching. I could hear the crackle of bones and the soft, wet sound of flesh shifting. Then, for the first time, it spoke. Not in words, not in a voice, but in something deeper, more primal. A sound that resonated in my bones, vibrating through the air. It was like a song, a deep, terrible harmony made from the voices of the many souls it had claimed. It didn't need to speak words. I understood what it wanted. It wanted me to give in. It wanted me to become part of it. But I couldn't. I wouldn't. I pushed away from the wall, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The creature loomed over me, its faces, arms, and legs twisting and merging into one unholy mass. The pillar of limbs in the center of the room began to glow faintly, a sickly light that pulsed in time with the creature's movements. I realized then that the creature wasn't just a predator. It was a collector. A being that thrived on absorbing others, on taking their bodies, their faces, their identities. The people it had taken had become part of this place. Part of it. And once it had me, it would grow even larger, even stronger. The limbs on the pillar stretched toward me, their fingers brushing against my arms, my legs, tugging gently, as though urging me to surrender. But I couldn't. I wouldn't become another part of its twisted collection. With a sudden surge of desperation, I reached out and grabbed one of the limbs from the pillar, a long, twisted arm, cold and lifeless beneath my grip. The thing attached to the pillar twitched, and for a brief moment, I felt it, the connection. I wasn't just touching a body, I was touching something deeper, something trapped within this place. A voice, not mine, whispered in my mind. Help us. The voices weren't from the creature. They were from the people it had absorbed, the people it had taken. Help you, I whispered, my voice barely audible, even to myself. How? The creature stopped, its many faces turned toward me, as though sensing the shift. It moved closer, its limbs dragging across the floor, the terrible grinding sound of its body scraping against the walls. I tightened my grip on the limb, and without thinking, I pulled. A scream, a terrible, inhuman sound, ripped through the chamber, shaking the very walls. The creature recoiled, its many faces contorting in agony. I pulled harder, feeling the weight of the thing beneath me as it writhed. The limbs around me began to twitch, convulsing violently as though the entire structure was rebelling. The creature roared, its many voices blending into one horrific sound. It lunged toward me, its grotesque form shifting, desperate to reclaim what it had lost. But I kept pulling, the arm in my hand coming loose, the voices in my mind growing louder. And then, with one final yank, the pillar collapsed. The walls shuddered, the limbs falling limp, and the creature screamed, a sound that echoed through the tunnel and beyond. It writhed and twisted, its body losing cohesion, faces and arms and legs melting into each other as it disintegrated. The air seemed to explode around me, the walls crumbling, the ground beneath me giving way. And then, everything went black. I woke up on the subway. The familiar hum of the train moving along the tracks filled the air. The car was empty, just like before. The lights overhead flickered, casting everything in that same unsettling, dim glow. I blinked, my body stiff, a deep ache throbbing in my limbs. I sat up slowly, my mind racing. It had to have been a dream. It felt real, too real. But I was back on the train now. The nightmare, the creature, the writhing limbs. It couldn't have been real. My head spun as I tried to piece it all together. The train slowed, the screech of brakes pulling me from my thoughts. I stood up, gripping the pole next to me as the doors slid open. The station outside was bathed in the same dim light I had seen before. Empty, silent, just like that other station, the one that didn't feel quite right. I hesitated for a moment, staring out at the platform. My pulse quickened, an uneasy familiarity settling into my bones. The walls looked damp, dirty, but nothing moved, nothing twisted out of place. A chill crawled up my spine as a thought, dark and unwelcome, crept into my mind. This isn't over. I stepped off the train, my feet heavy, the weight of something unseen pressing down on me. The platform stretched out in front of me, the walls covered in strange symbols that looked familiar, too familiar. I glanced back at the train, half expecting to see it vanish the way it had in the nightmare, but it sat still, waiting, almost inviting me back inside. The doors slid shut with a soft hiss, and the train rumbled away, leaving me alone. I turned back to the platform. My heart raced, a cold sweat trickling down my neck. The station felt wrong, just like it had before. The dripping water, the moisture on the walls, the grime, all of it. I had been here before. The realization hit me like a punch in the chest. This wasn't the first time I had woken up like this. The train, the station, the creature. It was all happening again. And it would happen again. I turned around, desperate for a way out. There had to be something, some exit, but the platform was endless. The dark, distant corners stretched impossibly far, the symbols on the walls flickering in the dim light. My heart pounded harder, the familiar creeping sense of dread curling around my throat. A figure stood at the far end of the platform. Still, silent, watching me. I backed away, my mind racing. This had happened before. The figure, the shadows, the thing that followed me through the endless tunnels. I knew how this ended. I knew what was coming, but I couldn't stop it. The figure shifted, its limbs stretching unnaturally as it took a step forward. The dim light cast strange shadows over its form, distorting it, making it look wrong. Its arms were too long, its head tilted at an impossible angle. I tried to tell myself it wasn't real, that it was just my mind playing tricks on me. But I knew. Deep down, I knew. I wasn't escaping this. I turned and ran. My legs felt heavy, my steps uneven, like I was wading through thick air. The platform blurred around me as I sprinted toward the stairs at the far end, the same stairs that had led me deeper into the nightmare before. The creature behind me, it was getting closer. I could hear the soft crackling, the sound of joints bending in ways they shouldn't, growing louder. I took the stairs 2 at a time, my heart thundering in my chest, sweat soaking through my shirt. The familiar hallways closed in around me, the walls pulsing and alive, just like before. I was stuck. I was trapped. I knew what was coming. I knew how this would end, the same way it always did. As I ran, my breath ragged and sharp, the tunnel narrowed, the walls pressing in. Limbs, so many limbs, stretched out from the walls, grasping at me, their fingers curling as they tried to pull me back. I pushed through, pulling away from their cold, slick touch, my mind screaming at me to keep moving. But there was no escape. There never was. The thing was behind me, and I could hear it. Closer, closer. Its many legs scraping the ground, its twisted faces whispering, laughing, calling me back into its embrace. I don't know how much more of this nightmare I can take, but I guess I don't have a choice. I'm stuck in this place. It's a loop, a nightmare. I've been through it again and again. Every time I think I've escaped, I end up back on the train. The creature, the faces, the arms, they're all part of something bigger, something that's been pulling people in for God knows how long. It's weird. My phone battery has lasted this long, but I'm going to stop recording now. Oh, and if you're hearing this, you're probably stuck here too. By now, I'm probably part of that creature.